So, welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today we continue with my special series of authors that have just released books in continental philosophy, in classical German philosophy, and post-Kantian thought. And today I'm joined by a very, very good friend of mine, mentor, and special guest, Dr. Jay Goulding, who is an associate professor at York University in the Department of Equity Studies and specializes in both Chinese and Japanese philosophy and hermeneutic phenomenology. Dr. Goulding's research interests continental philosophy, classics, Wang Bi's reconstruction of Laozi, and Daodejing, Cheng Chung-ying's ontocosmology, and Chinese philosophy, as well as Jung's Daoist Phenomenology, Heidegger, Schelling, Daoism, and Heidegger's engagement with Chinese and Japanese philosophy. If you are lucky enough to take any of Dr. Jay Goulding's classes, he teaches Dao, Zen, Heidegger, and vertical reading as a method. And today we are talking about this wonderful new text, which I was given by Dr. Goulding. It's a phenomenal text. I highly recommend this book. It's absolutely wonderful. The title is Daoist Phenomenology of Vertical Reading by Jay Goulding, Bloomsbury, 2025, which features Goulding's innovative Daoist phenomenology. In the text, East and West come together to create an original, hybrid, and organic form of phenomenology. Goulding's book contains major and minor chapters on figures like Heidegger, Schelling, Gadamer, Laozi, Zhuangzi, Dogen. The renowned philosopher Dr. Jason Wirth, who is also on this channel, has described the book as highly original and erudite. The Tao emerges not as an exotic doctrine, but as the way of all beings. Goulding's Daoist phenomenology represents a lifelong project of interpolating the works of Martin Heidegger with the interweavings of Daoism and Zen. The text illustrates highly original and unique styles, reading complex texts from Europe and East Asia. Goulding moves away from the traditional horizontal reading methods of simple comparisons on a single plane to a vertical reading, which he describes as a deep dive into the ideas of the ancient worlds. Goulding's vertical reading is a hermeneutic strategy that captures the depth of connection between phenomenology, Taoism, especially with Heidegger and classical Taoists like Laozi and Zhuangzi. His method reveals Taoist implications of Dogen, Zen, and draws on the writings and ideas from popular culture, including Jules Verne, H.P. Lovecraft, Philip K. Dick, George Lucas's Star Wars universe, and martial artist Bruce Lee. Original, wide-ranging, Goulding's interconnected approach to phenomenology and Taoism enhances and promotes further intercultural dialogues between two great traditions in world philosophies. An absolutely fascinating read for anyone, and I say this, who loves philosophy, phenomenology, and East Asian studies. So welcome, Dr. Goulding, on the Young Idealist today.
Well, thank you very much, Christopher. And I think seeing you on Zoom reminds me of the wonderful work that you did during the pandemic years when we met several times a week looking at Schelling texts and looking at medieval German and thinking through. And here we are now. So I was going to say, I promised Christopher I wouldn't say this, but I'm going to say one line that he's done a magnificent job bringing a lot of people together that otherwise would not be together. I'm just delighted to have finally made it to this point. I said I didn't intend it to be this way, but it worked out this way that my book is being seen as a trilogy, is the third in the trilogy of books put together by David Chai for his series. And I said, congratulating Christopher for its efforts. There's two people I have to speak of. One is David Chai, the series editor, that did the first book devoted solely to Heidegger and Taoism is this book called Taoist Resonances in Heidegger, Exploring a Forgotten Debt. It's a one person I have to congratulate for giving me a chance. I have a paper in here. It's mostly on Schelling and Heidegger for anyone who wants to look at that. It's a wonderful book to begin with. The second book in the series is Heidegger and Tao, is by Eric Nelson that came out last year, Things, Nothingness, and Freedom. And as it worked out, my book came out a little sooner than I thought on Daoist Phenomenology of vertical reading. It's going to start reading a very small piece to throw together the context of these three books that I put in the introduction, and people see this is the concluding part of the trilogy. As I said, it seemed to work that way. What I've said is that whereas David Chai's edited Taoist resonance provides an echo, an unclung of the abandoning of being through Taoism and Heidegger, Eric Nelson's Heidegger and Tao, Things, Nothingness, Freedom offers a primordial beginning, an unfung, as an inaugural essencing of being through a rethinking of Heidegger and Tao. In addition to these two path-breaking works, my own volume promises a fleeting shimmer as an Aufklung, both visually and acoustically, to and from Heidegger's clearing on the way to a betweenness of Tao and Zen. And then with those three books through what I call a vertical reading, if I were to provisionally assign a single Chinese character to Chai's monumental work of gathering the most talented scholars, it would be Ming, the Chinese Ming, a mouth gate, an opening that calls for itself into the twilight half moon, the dusk at evening that names nothing, the name that preserves. Without, as I said, without brave souls like Chai, Heidegger's name itself might be but a rumor rather than an echo. For Nelson, I would assign a second Ming, a sun and a moon together as bright, the two celestial luminosities that spawn Heidegger's clearing between the word and the image, the opening for all that is presence and absence. And then for my own book, which I said is best to be named by readers, I assign a third Ming as a silhouette to the second, a dimming down of the sun, submerging for 6 double hours under a glooming cover of heavenly night, what I call the darkling as a shadow summoner. Now, I think I came up with this idea because of the brilliant scholar Jason Worth, whom will always be my friend for the nicest things that he said to me when we've met. And the nicest things he said that will always be on the back of this book is what he calls the fire summoner in his translations and commentaries on Schelling's Deities of Samothrake, which is magnificent, magnificent work. So I'm situating this book is part of this trilogy. And there's a lot of different traditions that have come together. And I have to talk a little bit more about myself with this because I think I've come up with something different of what I call Daoist phenomenology. And I'm going to turn the clock way back to Hawaii in the late 1960s. Okay, I'll say it. It was there because my father was getting an award. We were staying at the King Kamehameha Hotel. And my parents saw that there was a big conference at the University of Hawaii at Honolulu. It was happening. So you're just starting university. We think you should go to it. At the East-West Center is the Jefferson Building, which is magnificent at the University of Hawaii. And it was the first ever Heidegger conference there in November 1969. And that's where I met Professor Cheng. Christopher, you very graciously mentioned Professor Cheng just passed on last year. I did a Festschrift paper for him, but he really got me going to think about doing philosophy, get to university, get to the Far East. Starting with Hawaii is quite magnificent. And in that paper, I've written that Harlan Cleveland, who was the new president of the University of Hawaii at that time, was actually at one time United States representative to the United Nations, gave one of the best talks from a layperson on Heidegger that I have ever heard. Now he's being coached by Glenn Gray and some other people about calculative thinking and meditative thinking. And it was very magnificent. So this got me into studying with Gadamer, as I was very lucky to do, because he spent a number of the first term of several years at McMaster University, which is just 20 miles from my home. So I imagine going to university and the first person I met virtually at university was Gadamer. It was really something. What got put into play, though, is there's a fellow named Zygmunt Adamszewski, who was a major student of Heidegger, who was the chair of philosophy at Brock. He was at the conference with Professor Cheng in Hawaii. And recently, in the last couple of years, um, I got together with some of his students that shuffled back and forth between Brock and McMaster for the Gadamer years. So I said, there's a lot of people that, along the way that you don't expect that things would work this way, but here we have it. I dedicated my book not only to David Chai, my hero, but Dr. Hahn, my physician, Jeanette Hahn, who taught me about the philosophy of medicine and the medicine of philosophy. And what she said is the world needs philosophy right now. And I said, that's why Christopher should be applauded for bringing so many people from different traditions together. So what I did in this book, as well as I said, I can't ask people to go and spend thousands of hours studying classical Chinese or medieval Japanese. So I use a lot of popular culture examples here to try to draw people together to say, maybe that'd be a place to begin. In this book, as well, I have a number of chapters that are looking at Tao as the origin of Zen, or one of the origins of Zen, mostly because people think they should know about Zen. It's the Zen thing has become a popular expression. And some of these traditions are very divergent, but they have moments of convergence as well. I started with Henry Harris, H.S. Harris, and Harris is a very good Hegel scholar. And as I got further into working with him, I found that it was Schelling that was more familiar to me than Hegel. And he encouraged me to do that. So something I've talked about uh, in this book are connections, snippets of connections that Schelling has with China. Because we had the big Schelling conference at York a couple of years ago, I had to write a paper, writing several papers at once. There are some really good translators. I said, again, Jason Worth really tickled my fancy as to what he was able to do with very difficult ideas. And I said, what I came up with, what am I going to do with Schelling? Because there's so much that he's written. I came up with Schelling's lectures on Tao. A lot of people don't like these lectures very much. They're fairly scanty, but the first line had me. I said, I'm going to have to look at all the German texts on this. Tao is a portal. I said, that's it. I'm all in on Schelling. It's not reason. It's not God. It's not something else. It's a portal to another dimension. And we know that in those days, Schelling is now the chair of philosophy at Berlin. He has just enough time to introduce an idea while he moves on to the next idea. He leaves it there for you. He said, I really can't spend any more time in this because I'm doing other things, but this is what you could do with it. And I think that's very amazing. It's a methodology that was, I think, taken very seriously by Heidegger when his time came, is you can point somebody in one direction, let them go where they're going to go. They don't have to follow you. I said, here I am, was probably 40 years into doing hermeneutics until I realized that hermeneutics isn't so much about the meaning of something, but it's pointing to or the showing forth of something. It's about the Bedeutung, but it's also about the Andeutung. The further you go back in time, if you look at the dictionaries that Schelling looked at, then look at what Heidegger wrote. Anytime I had any difficulty with Heidegger, all that I hear, including at the book launch recently, is Heidegger's hard to read. That might be a good thing. If everything were easy to read, then we'd all think the same. It is difficult to read, but the older you go, the easier it becomes. And any question I ever had was pretty much answered when we looked at the German text. But the German text of Heidegger is not really from the 1930s or 1940s. It's from the 1830s and 1840s. And as I was saying to Jason Worth, they're all German words. They're all used every day, but you get a certain configuration of words together and you realize that 7 or 8 main philosophical terms in Heidegger coming from Schelling. Schelling starts it, Heidegger takes it in its own direction. So I said those two together make a formidable force to be reckoned with. that are going to shake whatever the foundations are of what you think things are. So what do we know about East Asia? We mostly knew about popular cultures. You know, Heidegger for his era had both Chinese and Japanese scholars in his classrooms. And I don't know anybody else of this era that did that. And that's quite amazing. It's something that he should be revered for. There are some people along the way from other eras that bring some scholars. Um, uh, at the time of Vico, yeah, Matteo Ripa, that lived for 25 years in China, he brought some Chinese scholars back with him to Naples. And both the Vatican and the existing Spanish Inquisition at that time were starting to fade, said, well, they look like they might be from Turkey. They're not too scary. I guess they're okay. And I said, this is very interesting because there are institutes like the Collegio di Cinese that still exists at Naples that looks at that interconnection of East and West thinking. Now, my big project was always to really try to teach Heidegger to China through Tao and Tao to the Western world through Heidegger. What I've said in Japan is that Heidegger is already part of the canon in Japan. The word Tetsugaku, a Japanese word that meant philosophy, in its early years was invented to handshake with the West. The two main thinkers that carried on with this were Henri Bergson and Heidegger. Probably after 1917, Bergson is getting ill, so he's not the main figure. Heidegger becomes the main figure with this. In Japan, just died recently is Kimura Bin, a very famous psychiatrist who did Daseins analysis, is very interested in Heidegger, a little bit in Schelling. Christopher, I think you attended the lectures of scholars in Japan that carried on with work on Schelling are very important. Things that were taken for us for our era. Habermas did a dissertation, one of his dissertations on Schelling. Nishitani does a dissertation on Schelling. A lot of people did dissertations on Schelling. It seems to have fallen through the cracks for various reasons. Can you bring them back together? Um, so, although my main focus is on Taoist texts and interconnection with Heidegger, Schelling comes along the way as a very important figure, and this is what I came out of it, is little snippets of things. Jules Verne really isn't getting going until Schelling is gone in the 1850s. But some of Schelling's friends and associates, such as the Grimm brothers and the Humboldt brothers, one of them had died, but going back a number of years, most of them attended the 1842 lectures. All of them had some type of connection with Jules Verne. And it really got me. I read Jules Verne when I was a kid. When I got into it again, there's some amazing things, including Jules Verne being fascinated with early views of nature from the 1700s by Schelling. Now, Schelling had moved on to other things. Verne stayed there. So suddenly I'm finding that the Grimms took on the task, can you outdo Herder with essays on language? They became very fascinated with China because of Schelling. Um, and the Humboldts as well. One a scientist, one basically a linguistic philosopher, did so as well. So that combination of things were unique. And when you're writing anything, you didn't quite expect it ever to be that way. So I wrote some about this in the book, building up around Schelling. I have to give some kudos to Sean McGraw too, because his work is really amazing on mystical thinkers around Schelling. Very nice things that both Sean McGraw and Jason Worth have said about me, and I'm carrying on and reciprocating with that, writing good things about them in my book, hoping that other people look at the wonderful work that they've done. It's not just one person. So I've got three books. That's a field, Daoist Phenomenology. Um, how is it different than what the West would call phenomenology? We have a lot of different phenomenologies. What I call vertical reading, that we are stuck with reading horizontally. Heidegger taught about neither uh, horizontal nor vertical, but horizontal. Merleau-Ponty is gleaning some things, I believe, from Heidegger around what he calls vertical being. We need a vertical dimension, which I would call Chinese philosophy. The Japanese call the in-betweenness Aida or Aidagara. The Chinese call it Jen. And I said, when you put all these things together, you see that phenomenology has a lot of possibilities. Now, I've also, in this book, I've got some really heavy text, and I was going to say David Chai just published an incredible book that I wrote a review of called The Shang which is a medieval commentary on Daoism that makes me completely rethink everything I thought I knew about Dao. And I said that when you stop like that, this is amazing. Someone at the book launch asked, what happened to you like 41 years ago? You were like teaching social movements. What happened to you? And I thought there's the term that Heidegger used that Gadamer liked was called the Stoss. A Stoss is something that hits you that says, I'm going to go a different direction. And that's something that struck me when I was teaching social movements and I moved to the cultivation of stillness at the center of motion, which is a Taoist principle. Um, there are a few people like Hoyle Jung and that I worked on a festschrift for, is passed on now. Buddhist monk in Korea in the 1930s, became very famous in the United States. Wu Guangming, who I consider to be one of the top three Taoist translators in the history of the United States, and Cheng Chung-ying, top Neo-Confucian thinker probably of our era. Those three people you put together, Tao, Confucius, and Buddha, become part of the three teachings in China, in the history of China, that all three of them study with John Wilde, and all of them talk about the um, uh, the Tao of phenomenology, as does Wilde. Um, and I think putting those three together, they're backbones of what you could do with cross-cultural, what's now called Chinese and comparative thought. Now, I've expanded that, I think, with a few other people like Hans-Georg Muller, who did magnificent work. Muller mostly does classical China. He did some work on Niklas Luhmann, changed my views of everything, because for our era we're doing Habermas. He lived in Germany in those days, but the main person was Niklas Luhmann, don't forget him. So the idea of finding ways in between East and West. And I said, right now, I said there's a lot of ways that you could go with it. For our world, like Christopher and I, for our era, and a lot of other people, we did Hegel, Kant, and others in the Western tradition, up through Nietzsche and to Freud and so forth, which otherwise I would might call the materialist tradition. That's fine. That's wonderful. What else is there? Heidegger, Schelling, Leibniz, all the way down to Meister Eckhart, through some medieval thinkers into Plotinus and then to the pre-Socratics would be an alternative tradition, a European tradition, and a spiritual tradition. Henry Harris pointed to these things with me. He said, look, I'm going to do this because that's what I like. But somebody's got to do these other things. You could do it. I said, that's going back 50 years ago. Also, Gadamer promoting me to get to Hawaii, study Chinese, study Greek. Guys, when I was 18 years old, I had to regain consciousness when I first met Gadamer. Study Chinese, study Greek. I've been to Hawaii. Well, get there again and study these two traditions. Start on it now. Is like, he was like a prophet to me saying this. This is what you should do. And the first person I had in a classroom where they would bring Greek text and hand it to you, those are the good old days. There was a person that plucked up courage for me named Rick Haddon, who was in his 30s. He was a senior grad student in the early 70s, long passed on, unfortunately. But he said, come with me, it'll be okay. Gadamer will like you, and handed me Greek. And I said, I don't think I know what this is. Well, you will. This is Gadamer, but he encouraged you to carry on with things and to work your way through. And I said, does it mean this or does it mean this? He said, that's interesting, Gadamer. I never thought of it that way. You continue to work on that. There wasn't any one way. This is what I found with hermeneutics, is that hermeneutics had a biblical air to it in the old days with Schleiermacher and others. What Heidegger and a couple people did is bring that into everyday texts as well. Adam Shefsky, that he had done a book called The Tragic Protest, which I recently got a copy of again, which was a Heideggerian reading of Shakespeare. We did the first SPEP in the early 70s um, because of Gadamer. Gadamer shuffled back and forth. There's a fellow named John Beach that I hadn't seen for 50 years, was Gadamer's driver, studied at Brock, that will come to Gadamer societies. And it was very nice for David Vesey to invite me. I'm going to be going again soon. We got Don Marshall, who has done many books, translated Truth and Method, was reissued by Bloomsbury as a lovely edition. They're all waiting for me, waiting for 50 years for someone to come and talk about these traditions again. Gives us different angles. German philosophy developed through a number of mystics. Now, Pfeiffer has a text that's written in real medieval German text. I have a copy of it. Bentz uses as a basis of his work. Maybe we could carry on. Maybe McGraw has done some things beyond that, but it's a good one to look at. Daoism is not about just going with the flow. It's going against the flow a little bit. Based on Philip K. Dick's work, there is a movie, a very good movie, um, with Tom Cruise in it. It's called Minority Report. Is one of the images of going against the grain. If you're going with the flow, they've got you. You're caught in the grid. Wonder if you move a little right angle to it from time to time. Wonder if you wiggle away. This is what I think Schelling did during and after the revolutionary periods when he was being pressed by other people to go different directions. Schelling stuck his guns. Part of the inversion you see when you get into Schelling literature is the importance of Hölderlin and Schelling together. As much as anyone would say about how controversial these characters are, good for them, is that they get us to think about things in a little different way. Schelling and the order of things. Schelling learning several ancient languages because of his father early in his life, going to university, I think by the time he's 15 or 16. Hölderlin being a kind of chaperone for Schelling. Did he go mad? Did he feign madness? These are very, very interesting, intriguing things. And I've always been the type of person that wanted to go against the grain. Everybody's going that way. Maybe I want to go a slightly different way. Tried to get Hofstadter to York at one time, who was a good Hegel commentator and translator, because that's what we mostly did in those days. We were never able to do that. And I think now when Christopher and I were talking, a few other people, we generally know more about the malaise of things or the milieu of things than Hofstadter did when he translated Heidegger texts. He also did a fantastic job, but when in doubt, he would default to Hegel positions, but they're not. There's something else. That's something I've learned. I think it was, and I have to give credit to Christopher for because I had done Schelling 40, almost 50 years ago. In the last few years, Christopher said, Dr. J, please, please look at Schelling. You're going to like this. Non-Euclidean space, subjects without the eye, the non-pedestrian view of Aristotelian time, non-conceptual thinking. You're going to find this in Schelling, and then it's going to change how you think of the world, especially with Heidegger. You're going to start making connections that you didn't make before. Um, in the case, and Christopher said I might talk a little bit about Tao, there's a couple of main characters in Tao, the two being Laozi and Chuangzi. Laozi wrote the poems, the Daodejing. There's probably more translations of the Daodejing going than to any other book. It's very, very popular. I remember being in San Francisco. We were doing a panel on Richard Rorty. The only person in the audience was actually Richard Rorty that I brought to the panel because they've heard it all before. I'm walking down the street. I go into a bookstore and I said, they got a Daodejing in this corner bookstore. I'm going to buy it. a corner bookstore with the Daodejing. Walked out on the street and someone gave me um, uh, a pass to get out of Alcatraz. They said, "You're going to need this pass to get out." What was the pass to get in for a tour of Alcatraz? So it was very interesting. A Daodejing in one hand and a pass to get out of Alcatraz on a tour from. So what I've said in the book and some essays I've written is that you start the dig. X marks the spot is like a treasure hunt. That's part of its hermeneutics. The phenomenological fields that you need to navigate along the way come down through the abyss. You need a place to rest every once in a while. Let's say Friedrich Nietzsche, brave soul, just flew through the abyss without much to stop him. No place to navigate. Free falling. If you can find a level along the way, that's a great thing. Jules Verne, and this is what kept coming to mind again and again. Actually, in the movie version, James Mason uses an expression from Laozi. Every journey begins with one step. If anyone is reading these texts, I said, there's nothing like the French. This is the original. It's unbelievable. There are things that are probably not translatable. I will ask a lot of people, but it's magnificent. You have to feel your way through it. Scarteris, at the end of May, beginning of June. If you get there in Iceland, there will be a beam of light come through an extant volcano to see an opening in the side of a wall that's of rock that's 5 miles long. It will be the journey to the center of the earth. So it's very fascinating. Um, Jules Verne and what he knew for his time, and the influence then of the Humboldt brothers and the Grimm brothers on this. And just even said in passing, these are fascinating images of what China would be. They're sincere, I think. There'll be a lot of people could say a lot of things about China as an imaginary world. What Professor Cheng did, um, writing more than 300 articles in China as a leading Neo-Confucian, was to see Kant as a representative of a snapshot of China. So there's a Chinese element in Kant as well. You see it in Schelling, you see it in other people. So that I said I'm interested in that one moment. In the Western world, mostly you see every moment the instance of the same time. Christopher sees me every week. I wear the same tie, look about the same, and so forth. In the Far East, every moment an instance of a different time. So moving through what I call the rabbit hole is very important here. Something, and I took it up with Jason Wirth as well, I discussed it with David Krell, is that for those in your wonderful group that study Greek, Heidegger, there was no evidence that he ever looked at Liddell and Scott, ever looked at it. He's looking at, first of all, Greek text to get the context of things. That's where you want to go. And if you want any help along the way, look at the German text in the 1700s. Schneider, Schellers, Pazoff in the 1830s. Lord Liddell translates the Pazoff text. I pointed out, being joking about it, it's also called the Great Scott because it was Liddell and Scott. I've been looking at dragging this book around since 1964. Along the way, there were some people like Darcy Thompson and Guthrie in the 30s and 40s that tried to bring other interpretations into those texts, especially with the German text. Because after all these years looking at the first line, this is a translation of Pazoff. And I said, I don't think I looked at that since the early 60s. Is it? Not really. It's been reconfigured, brilliantly reconfigured. When I was studying Chinese many years ago, all the characters look the same when you start. You have to be able to differentiate one from another. So the sameness becomes a collectivity of difference. Very famous line from Heidegger. I was at a PhD recently, and so here's a Taoist take on this. Someone asked me all these questions. PhD defenses, but friendly. Asked, what's the difference between Eastern and Western civilizations if you're talking about psychoanalysis? I said, in the Western world, you awake from the dream. In the East Asian world, you awake to the dream. I've talked about this. The one person that understands this intimately, that breathes it, is David Chai. He understands a facility with ancient Chinese texts like no one else of this era. So I can't give him enough kudos on this, but he's made me rethink as a very humble person. He just points you to it. He doesn't explain it too plainly. Something that I think Gadamer picked up from Heidegger. Heidegger said maybe the greatest scholar in the history of Europe was Hegel. What can we do with it? And Heidegger begins, as he's discussing and analyzing Hegel, to lay out his own arguments as he recedes from it, as he disappears into the midst of time's passing, as he vanishes into things around him, as he fades into the oblivion of the world, is the way I discuss it. What I said of those things is, guess what? The entire architectonic of this, and a reviewer said this recently, Goulding has come across an architectonic of Heidegger that needs further explanation that brings him in a parallel universe to Taoism. What happens is Laozi is so abstract in any which way you look at it that there would be, even of Chinese speaking people today, maybe there's 1% that understand anything of what he's talking about because the references are different. If you get into it, it's the most amazing world. Guys, I did it. I did two things. I did fragments. I love doing fragments. Plato and Aristotle absolutely drove me nuts when I was doing classics because there's so much of it. I ended up rehearsing what other people were doing. Is there any way I can say something on my own? Do the pre-Socratics, Anaximander, Anaximenes, and others. Heraclitus, Parmenides. Took me until I was nearly 50 and even being there to realize that all these guys, most of them, lived in Italy at some time. It's Heidegger in his biography of the Greeks that said after Socrates, people left town. They either moved to North Africa, they moved to Italy, and they kept coming back there. And this has an influence on his work. I remember John O'Neill, who's a famous Merleau-Ponty translator. I just wrote a paper for it called The East Asian Communicative Body. In the 1960s, he translated 5 or 6 Merleau-Ponty books. Is he said, how do you get into China? I can't do it. I'm looking on the outside. I'm going around the outside. I can't find any way to get in. When I first started studying Chinese, there was only one book that had any English in it. It was the Oxford Dictionary of Business, which today I know nothing about. I know that I got $50 in the bank and I owe Christopher $100, so I'm going to have to get saving my money. That's all I know. That's why I started with Japanese too, because you had some English and you had larger characters so you could see what it was. And I said, all these texts are thousands of texts. China is one of the cultures, if not the main culture, of invented writing. They got zillions of ancient texts. How do I get into that? Fragments. Laozi, he's only got a few poems. I did the same with uh, ancient Greek. If you want to look at the text, look at Heraclitus and look at Parmenides. They have fragments of things. Yes, they're difficult. Kirk and Raven did something in the 1950s, 60s. By the late 60s, I'm looking at their books, not too expensive. What they did is say, here's our translations of the pre-Socratics, and here's the Greek at the bottom. And it took me 3 months to learn the alphabet. And then I realized it's like our alphabet. That's why it's called the alphabet, and so forth. And you can move into other things with this. Wonderful person named Chantrain, for anyone interested, dies around 1975. Does classical Egyptian, classical Hebrew, classical Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and everything in between, like Sumerian, Hurrian. So he takes you all the way to China. There will only be one person like this. If anyone ever read text by Burnell called Black Athena that changed the way I thought about the uh, psychogeography of the Mediterranean and the Aegean, then look at Burnell. Burnell was a guy who did kind of maybe the opposite of me, did Chinese stuff to begin with and then moved into Egypt and the Middle East. I had one student that said, look, I can't study this stuff. I only know Hebrew and I know English. What do I do? Look at the pre-Socratics. It's a sound shift away from classical Egyptian with a little bit of imagination. That's amazing. What I did when you're studying Chinese text, you need a little bit. Lao Tzu had a poem. Can I do one poem? Can I look up a few characters? Can I see what they are? What are their etymologies? And then I realized what Heidegger did. It allowed me to do Heidegger and Schelling. Without Chinese, I don't think I could have done it. Heidegger and Schelling also pressed me forward to do the Chinese because they bring shape to the thinking. It's no longer just a flat line horizon. And now you have a cursor. I asked my students the other day, in a class where maybe one person might know, what is a cursor? They said, well, this thing that goes and you have to follow it if you're going to read anything. Do you know what it means? Well, no. It's a Latin word. What does it mean? Well, let's look it up. What does it say? Oh, a runner. We're following that runner along the line. And after a while, we can't stop any longer. We have to just keep following it because we're giving 800 pages here and there. You do politics, you get 800 pages to read a week. To study with Dr. J, I give people 1 page to read a week. Maybe one line, maybe one word. Might not be an English word. Might be an Egyptian word, a Chinese word. See what you can find out about it. When you do that, you have to pause. I was going to mention Livy Vissano, who said something very interesting. Livy Vissano is a criminologist. He's not a philosopher. He said Heidegger is difficult to read. Maybe you can't read him. Maybe you have to feel what it is. So that's part of vertical reading. You have to feel what something is, but you need organs to perceive that. You don't have them yet. Not the ones that you have. You have to reshape them. For me, Schelling is along the way to reshaping those things. You know, my students have stopped along the way. They used to be, if I mentioned the word Schelling, they'd say, you mean Schiller? No, we don't mean Schiller, we mean Schelling. Schelling has got to find a way on the map again. This is what Dr. Hahn said. Find a way for philosophy on the map. People have to know what philosophy is. In my class, politics, economics, sociology, other things. A few people do philosophy. There's a lot of prerequisites for it. Some people only know the philosophy of the logical, rational world. That will get you to one narrative. There are a few people that do continental philosophy. There are some people, again, like Schelling, that wanted to look to other places, that wanted to look to the home of Jason and the Argonauts at Samothraki. And the archaeologists that I studied with, Sandy McKay, said you have to look beyond Athens, look beyond Athenian Greek, look at pre-Socratic Greek, look at the Greek of the Ionian coast. You know, guys, even though I went he was the only professor I knew that would take his students for 50 years to Italy and Greece. 50 years to make the mute stone speak, as he would quote from some of his associates, such as McKendrick. He could pick up a pile of rubble and say, it's not from here. This is from someplace else. He brought shape to things, worked with Marinados on Crete, did all sorts of stuff to get me thinking about things. I promised Christopher I'd talk a little bit about East Asian stuff. I have to talk about people. McKay for Greek stuff, Gadamer for phenomenology, and Klaus Pringsheim was the first inventor of the Japan Studies Association. Pringsheim was the only person and had a lot of influence on me. Pringsheim, like me, I've become Pringsheim as a classical absent-minded professor that we would see walking down the street when I was driving to school at McMaster, and we'd stop, literally walking down the middle of the road carrying books. So, would you like a ride to class? Yes. My dad said, boy, is he ever absent-minded. So one day I hope to be as absent-minded as he is. #1 scholar on Japan in 1965. Prestigious salary of $11,500 at that time. But he was also a scholar on China as well. And he got me into study Chinese characters. And to do it, and you could look things up. You don't have to be a fanatic like me. Look up a single character. When I taught film for a number of years, I would write Chinese on the board every day. And people said, why are you writing Chinese characters? Because a Chinese character is a character. It has character. A Chinese character is a moving picture. It has radicals, 214 radicals. Schelling has a fascinating way. There's two things that Schelling really struck a chord with me. A coin that was lost or stolen that he had in his possession where he explained the potencies. Two things. If it weren't for Ned Beach, I would have never been able to figure any of this out. And if it were for Schelling's example of the coin, was absolutely amazing. That's one thing. Uh, what I was going to say something, it'll come back to me. I was going to say something else. Uh, Another thing Schelling did that Betty Radice talked about in her work. And thanks to McKay, I had 2 weeks sitting on a couch in Arts 3 at McMaster talking to Betty Radice, who was head of classics at Oxford University Press. I have had all these volumes of stuff looking at why did the Romans during times of peace have the doors shut, but during times of war have the doors open to the forum. Schelling talks about it. It's important because they bang their shields on the way out to war because they're calling the gods to give them good luck. Here's a mystical element of Schelling. Philosophy is not number one in the 1840s. It's competing with theosophy and theology. They're in charge. Schelling is trying to put philosophy on the map. So you have to have examples of where this is coming from. And there are mystical elements of it, but it leads towards philosophy. David Chai says this in ancient China. There were lots of mystics all together. And he's navigated through what he calls, I'll put it in quotation marks, the peculiar world of religious Taoism. He spent 25 years trying to figure it out so he can translate these things. He's at a point of doing it that the two main philosophers in ancient China, outside of Confucius, were Laozi with his fragments and Zhuangzi with his stories. Laozi is already there. He's already figured it out and he doesn't really want to tell anybody else. You have to figure it on your own. Zhuangzi tries to flesh out those stories 300 years later. And I said, I found the same thing with the pre-Socratic. So after 1936, Heidegger rarely uses the term pre-Socratic. Why should I predestine them to be other than what they are? They are what they are. And I said, because of looking at this, I see things in a different way. There's a convergence, a strange type of convergence between the fragments of classical Greece and the fragments of classical China, between the Taoists and the pre-Socratics. There are a few people that talk about that. Heidegger says as he moves east in his thinking that that truth is a storm long past, but there's still a freshness in the air. We have to get by Athens. We have to move as far as we can, maybe to the Far East to get there. So he starts translating in the 1940s some texts of the Daodejing. He has some comments from time to time. That's what my book is about. Nelson does a wonderful job. Chai with his group of superheroes. There isn't anything like it. But doing fragments, and if you're starting on something, it's almost, if you did, I'll mention Marcus Reisenleitner here, who has just finished his term as another grad director. He is an expert on like German etymologies, High German etymologies. I showed him stuff. He said, if you're doing Heidegger, it would be better for you not to know any German at all, so you can start fresh. And I showed him a word, Anwesen. We know what it is. Well, it's present. Would you see the Wesen? He says, no. Oh, yes, I do. Well, what is a Wesen? And what is a Wesen? Oh my God. So here's the idea of a dwelling here. It's covered over, our eyes are covered over with this like a veil because we use things in a popular contemporary narrative. Bring it to something other than that. This is where I came to the idea. Heidegger at the Bremen lectures, Heidegger said Bremen is a place where there was a lot of East Asian art. Maybe people could have an artifact in their hand or stand in a museum or an art gallery and I could tell them something about what I'm seeing with it. It is quite amazing. So this is where he would be talking about Heraclitus and Parmenides and both Chinese and Japanese scholars. Some Zen scholars, Zhuangzi is quite amazing. And these are texts that are mostly forgotten. And that's where I said fragments. You look through the interstices of things. You look at Philip Dick's expression, the perturbation in the reality field. That's what I think of when I'm reading Schelling. You don't say that Schelling is a stooge, or Schelling didn't pay a lot of attention to something. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He knows exactly what he's talking about. He wants to put it all out there for you. So you point to something and say, I don't have time to go any further, but you can go there. Heidegger says, find your own place to disappear, which is virtually a line from the redactor of Zhuangzi, Guashang. You have Wang Bi, redactor for Laozi, and Guashang. David Chai has written quite a bit about how these thinkers are on their own. They're not their original thinkers, but they're trying to point us to what they are. What Schelling does is help us with that pointing. But when you do so, you have to strip away your own identity. You have to strip away your horizon. So as I said with the psychoanalytic people, is that you awake to the dream, not from the dream in the Far East. So it's the dream of the butterfly. So the fragments, there's a lot of interconnections. And some people talked about it, that you can never step in the same river twice. And you see that image in Confucius. You see that image in the pre-Socratics. It's a place where I began. So I'm looking at the cracks in the wall. There's something when I wrote this book that I'd thought about, and I looked right at Jason Wirth, and I hadn't really thought about it before. But when I saw Jason Wirth, who is a very accomplished person and a Zen monk, as well as an outstanding philosopher and a really good Schelling translator and commentator, life is like a white horse moving through a crack in the wall. It's called Higaki no Komowa, the shadow of the sun horse in Dogen. In Dogen, the Zen monk from the 1200s, Dogen is only mentioned by a commentator once in Sujimura. We talked about Nishitani. I actually met Nishitani in the early 70s when he came to meet Gadamer. Spoke brilliant German. I didn't really know anything. Gadamer said, you will, and encouraged me to get on these things. Every journey starts with that one step. So Laozi had fragments about leaving the world, and a fairly high-ranking official in ancient China left it all. So we don't know where we're going and go up and live in the mountains. Didn't probably write anything down, but his students did. Are fragments that point to the way. If you name the way, you don't know what the way is. We were looking at some government documents recently, and we figured out what is freedom. Heidegger says you begin with bypassing the mystery. Freedom is openness to the mystery, from Schelling. What is freedom? Not freedom from or freedom to, but freedom is a letting into being itself, being as its own truth. I said it's very fascinating, also influenced by Schelling. This is what Gadamer calls this the Einblitz. Every once in a while you get an expression. Laozi, living in the mountains. Heidegger, living in the mountains. Patzitz and Pergler moved their homes up into the Black Forest so they could try to walk dozens of miles every day with Heidegger, sometimes up to 20 or more miles a day, which is a lot. If you could keep that up, this is not walking down Yonge Street like in Toronto. This is in the woods. Something I learned recently, came up with this on that account, that's actually helped me with the Chinese stuff quite a bit, is what we call the Holzwege. A wooded path is really a dead end. And it's not for humans to walk through, it's for the forest rangers. It's not about the forest, it's about the trees, about the bringing the trees out of the forest. Heidegger knew they were all dead ends. Maybe you can find a cul-de-sac there. What others might call, and one of the reviewers for my book said, we have a new Wegmarken. Um, uh, and a Denkmarken, a thinking along the way that people call a frontier marker. That if you're going into the forest, especially the Black Forest, you put a marker there to see where you could get in and where you could get out. And this is kind of lost in any of the translations. Some people, Will McNeill and David Krell, have a lot of experience. They've tried. I had a wonderful day with David Krell many years ago. Changed everything about how I thought about anything. Another great scholar. Was wonderful that Jason Wirth can connect up with him with such wonderful work. So Laozi leaves the world. And I say, here's a civilization that's at war with hundreds of millions of people either dying or being displaced. And Laozi comes up with something that's about peace. It's about withdrawing from the world, about letting the Tao show you the way. Not learning something every day, but forgetting. Forgetting, returning to the origin and following the way. Talk in the book and in the article in Chai's book about Schelling and potencies, Heidegger and the ekane, epicane, theorane, about a holding ground, a withholding, and a beholding. Little bit of kudos to Heine Schurman for the middle term there. Is when you're withholding, it's not something that you do. It's been done for you for 2,000 years, but can you find the scent of that freshness again? Really fascinating stuff. Forgetting something. And this is very important in Tao. The idea of what's called ziran, such as it is, to me is a phenomenological term. I have to congratulate both Muller and Ben Wu that I taught before for being two of the only people I really know in this era. There are a few others that know that Tao might be very much at the center of Zen. Zen has its own tradition, but there are Taoist priests that make their way into Japan. There was one Taoist emperor, Go-Daigo, that was interested in Taoist imagery. Oda Sensei, Norio Oda, that started the Japan Studies program here, and I helped him do the Chinese Studies programs at high schools in Canada, the first ones. He asked me one time, why is Taoism not important in Japan? As well, it was. Well, what times was it out of play? I said from 960 to 2006, it was banned, religious Taoism, because foreign philosophy that is very dangerous, but used by the shogun, you'll find lots of imagery of Tao mixed in with other things in Japan. And then we found out that Oda himself, his family had bought the property owned by Emperor Go-Daigo's son that was a monk. Here, Taoist principles again, you'll see them. And if you want to learn about Tao, you need to know something about Chinese philosophy, Chinese religion, um, Chinese medicine, and Chinese martial arts. So in my book, I have an example from time and again. Dr. Han says, remember, the philosophy of medicine is the medicine of philosophy. So that's what my sort of motto for this book is. So Tao, the way of the water. Go where water goes. Shift your perspective like water does. This is the main imagery of the Daodejing. And what Zhuangzi does is come up with stories that explain these things. Now, I'd say in all honesty, to those that were interested in the Far East and never read Schelling before, you can start anywhere you want. If you read those two lectures on Tao, are amazing. I think they're amazing insight there. Would I say the same thing for Confucius and Buddha to Schelling? No, they wouldn't be. Doesn't know enough about it. Poor Hegel. Poor Hegel only had 5 poems to look at for his era. And I made this argument with Harris. Harris says, it's interesting. You're trying to bring sort of Taoism into Hegel. Keep going with that. There is a fellow named Stanislav Julien that we know that Schelling read his works. He did most of what you call a complete translation of the works of Taoist classics. There's only 2 main thinkers. There's a third character called Lierze, who is, I call him an intertextual character. He might be one or the other. And Schelling had been able to read, and we know that he read that text. So you have Abel Remusa, that was a big shot, 1820s, probably the most knowledgeable person in the Far East. What do we do with Leibniz? Like, again, if you're a person studying the West, in the Western world, you're going to do Kant, Hegel. You might do Fichte, you might not. Because of McGraw and Beach and Worth and a few others, and a few more contemporary thinkers, Marcus, Gabriel, that Schelling is back on the board here. There'd be a lot of people that don't know much about Schelling, maybe want to know about. My era too, we did a lot of Hegel because of Harris. Remember the day that Harris said to me, T.M. Knox died today, so the last big time translator of Hegel in the world is me. And you know what? He's right. Some amazing stuff that it toward this toward the sunlight. It changed its title later. He spent 25 years writing Toward the Sunlight and another book, 25 years called Night Visions. And both there's a lot of mystical things involved in there, including mystical symbols and so forth, that not many people knew much about. Harris lived it. But I said to do something else, to go outside of this. Um, and you need, again, what Rick Haddon said, personal courage to go another direction, to find another way of going. That's what I liked about Schelling. He brings up people that oh no, we can't talk about these mystics. So that's so many people say, oh, even in Chinese, well, you can't talk about like Laozi and mysticism, right? You have to. But I put in a chapter on the difference between Eastern and Western mysticism. In the West, whatever this might be, you have mostly cults of personality in the West. You have texts in the East. I went to a monastery that had been caved in an earthquake in the 1100s that people hadn't been there for all that time, and it went with a few scholars, and somebody handed me a sutra that no one has ever seen before. And the people with me said, I've studied my whole life of this. I have no idea what this is. A monk came by, and when I'm retired, if that ever happens, I'm going to translate it. Boy, this is a lot of interesting stuff you could get in, and that's what I appreciate about Schelling and Heidegger. For whatever you wanted to say, they were able to look at those perturbations in the reality field and take them on, right? From a coin to an echo. Uh, Heidegger talks about an ornament and what that ornament was and what it could represent or not. I would claim that after 36, again, Heidegger mostly doesn't use the word conceptual because he's created a Vernehmen, an apprehension of things. And here is a Zier. It takes me to the idea of time as a tour and Zeit. And all these things come into play. You'll see what I say about it in the book. You can do that for lots of things. You can really do it for Arabic. You can really do it for Persian. These are languages that I don't know. They're going to be beyond me because I got my handful. But Christopher, they're not beyond you. And something that Christopher's put in place, Armenian, the importance of Armenia in the midst of all these things. There's some amazing things that you can do with this. So fragments of things, commenting on them. They've been collected together. You see them in Plato and Aristotle. You unfold them. One of the ideas I was working on, again, really seriously, is this idea of Ausdruck. A lot of different things. I found the expression Ausdruck meint Lichten der Lichtung als Ereignis, the the lighting of the clearing as the event. And I'm working on that right now. You have the idea of bearing out it, carrying out, and you get a whole vocabulary. And I talked to Rice later about it. Words around this you see in Heidegger. Some of them you'll see in Schelling, like Gebärde, getting your bearings. What is it for you to get your bearings? Someone said at my talk, while you were speaking, I noticed that the science fiction books all around us at the bookstore started to actually come out in a little bit of high relief. So I said, there's about a bit of perception. I wanted to say this about this book cover. Again, I'm blessing David Chai for making this possible, but somebody has figured out when they got this right. Dr. Han didn't like it, of course, because what are these Chinese characters? Can't read them. We do the Chinese version of it, we'll bring it out. But here are two characters that mean not doing, doing by not doing, wu wei, in the background, and they're hidden behind this sort of magenta, I don't know, purplish, bluish kind of square as part of the series. But I said, what this is a type of, I'm calling it again, with a little help from Gary Aylesworth, who was a brilliant Heidegger translator, an emerging egress. It's coming up a little bit in low relief, but it's also receding from you. That's part of Heidegger's methodology, some of which he gets from Schelling. I'm not going to tell you everything what it is. I'm going to lay it out there and point to something, let you find your way, something that recedes from you. And there's an allurement to it. You know, when I looked at this, I said, how do I translate looking at the Kuki Shuzo lectures and so forth in his engagement with Heidegger in the 1920s? Baron Kuki Shuzo, if he lived any longer, to me would have been the greatest Japanese scholar of our era. Tanabe Hajime is a student of Nishida Kitaro, comes into play. But there's some amazing things in this. How do I translate any of this stuff? I looked at what Heidegger did. I pulled up 30 words that Heidegger has to explain icky is a type of chicness and plucking up courage, a hare, and a cleanliness and an urbaneness and all these other things. Akanukesha is very complicated. 30 German words, and I threw it onto a computer and said, I'm going to come up with something here. I came up with Richard Wagner, which was very fascinating. And then starting Wagner, I said, you say a lot of things about Wagner. Who is Wagner's main influence of his philosophy? Friedrich Schelling. I said, these words are ultimately coming from Schelling. And then I started to look at some things that Schelling translated, things that Heidegger translated about the I Ching, maybe one example of it, the Book of Changes. Um, Schelling has talked about something. I said, can I gain some strength from that? Moving away from the system to asystaton and using the I Ching as an example of that. China had the perfect society because it had no language, it has no mythology, it has no movement. It is a perfect calm in the midst of things. It's the only time Schelling ever uses the term Laozi. I said, this is really neat stuff. So when I had, under duress of writing a bunch of papers, plus the Schelling Society coming up, I looked at these things. There'll be other people that talk about it, but they don't see it the way that I see it. This Ausdruck, too, is a bearing out of something, like giving birth to something. The time of Schelling, bearing, bringing to full term is a bearing, is having a baby. Um, you get all sorts of other things about coining expressions and so forth around this as well, which is fascinating. Interestingly enough, is Joan Stambaugh, who was a main Heidegger translator, was at Freiburg, only met Heidegger twice at Freiburg. I don't know why you'd be at Freiburg and not meet Heidegger. She's studying with other people. Met Heidegger on the street, became a main translator. She was at the first step, and she one of the first steps. Sorry, the very first, maybe or APA, one of the others goes to Hawaii and she met with Hannah Arendt and said, okay, we've got to talk about Hannah Arendt said, if you're doing Ausdruck, you've got to talk about giving birth. Oh no, you have to talk about perdurance. Today, I'm still hard pressed to say exactly what perdurance is. Arendt said, I told you what to do, that's it, bye. Stambaugh writes to Heidegger and he said, well, there's only one person, right? It's you, perdurance. That is an eternal endurance of being trying to find its way home. So you have that verlassenheit as an abandonment of being. Then you have a release with Gelassenheit, and then you have a return. And eventually Befindlichkeit is a founding of yourself, right? Ben Wu said to me, studied with John Wilde. As I said, I never met John Wilde, but he was at Freiburg in 31. Wilde was also interested in Schelling, but he's an elite Heidegger scholar, had scholarships to go there. He's always said there was an influence of Tao on Heidegger, and that influenced, again, Wu, Cheng, Huayou Jung all along the way. So we get this idea of the flow of a water, not setting something up and following a rule, but following the way. What Muller had said in his brilliant books on Daoism explained, he said, if you put rules down and you want people to follow rules after a while, they just won't do it. So it's like to have a rule for anything like Confucian virtues is to close the door, barn door after the horse got out. If you do nothing, all will be done. Do nothing, all will be done. He has some wonderful examples. Um, I remember meeting Muller. Muller was in Canada for a while, but we were in China, and it said we had a big bottle of Budweiser in front of us in Shanghai. Wonderful time with Muller. I asked him about how to understand Daoist texts. He said, well, this is when writing was lost. So you have to remember they're fragments of things. So you have water, a swirl of water that has disappeared in a tunnel that is pulling things down, a fulcrum, but it's probably from a stake, an imaginary or mystical stake, but you'll never see the stake, only its tail. That's what Tao is like. It's a fragment. You'll never see the totality of it. If you see the totality of it, you're lost. The samurai, I have several chapters of this, bring you to that threshold of sabi wabi, right on the edge of things, and then your life falls away. Because you're not meant to go any further. That's pretty fascinating. Only things that are real remain the same, but nothing remains the same. Therefore, nothing is real. Putting together the fragments of the pre-Socratics. And Dick uses images of Tao to try to do this. If you looked at his exegesis, it had a lot of influence on me.
What I think is really funny is this, is that normally my episodes for this series, I ask a series of questions, but this entire video is a vertical reading because not only did we not do questions, but you gave a lot of snippets, fragments of topics and themes through your book. And everybody here is getting a really good chance, a really good first glance at what your classes are like and why they're so fantastic and why you're drawn in by not just the Tao and Heidegger and Schelling and Zen and Dogen, uh, but you're drawn in by how you collect the story, how you bring in snippets of philosophy, hermeneutics, Tao, through your vertical reading. So I can't thank you enough for really giving us such a fantastic overview, but really a complete and utter presentation of your book. That's what this entire video, this episode has been. It's been a complete presentation, which you've done so nicely and succinct. So I can't thank you enough for doing this, Dr. Goulding.
Thank you very much, Christopher, giving me a chance. I hope that we can get together with others and keep going. This is I think is one of the most amazing things you've done to bring people together from such divergent traditions. God bless you.